Thank you, John. Thank you, John. I'm now going to share my screen. Hold on, wait 1 second. Obviously, this is not as easy as I thought it would be. Okay, so can you see my PowerPoint? Yeah,
yes.
okay, great. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Jamie Hakim. I'm a lecturer at King's College and I'm principal investigator on digital intimacies. I've literally just developed a sore throat, so I'm going to be drinking a lot. Welcome to our End of Project Symposium. It's been 2 years since we started the project, so we're super excited to be able to share what we've been doing and have such a great panel of academics as well as practitioners here to respond. I'm going to start the session by giving a brief overview of the project and then talk you through 2 of our key findings. I'll then be followed by my colleagues Ingrid and James Cummings, who are going to present further findings, and then Lauren Redfern, who will speak about our non-academic outputs. I should say that this event has been designed to bring together both academic and third sector audiences, and we've done our best to pitch our presentations accordingly. My presentation gets quite theoretical, so I can only apologise. I'll start by giving an overview of our research. Digital Intimacies is an ESRC-funded project that is hosted across King's College and Edinburgh University and partnered with the Terence Higgins Trust, London Friend and Waverley Care. We're an interdisciplinary project drawing on expertise in cultural studies, sociology of health, and social anthropology. The question that we set out to answer is, how do UK-based queer men use their smartphones to negotiate their cultures of intimacy? In posing this question, we wanted to make a couple of different interventions. Firstly, much work in this area rightly focuses on queer men's hookup app use. And whilst hookup apps have been absolutely central to the smartphone-mediated intimacies of the queer men we spoke to, other features of their smartphones have too. And by looking at these, we've been able to capture underexplored dynamics of these intimate cultures. We also wanted to make an intervention in the methodological approach that we've taken. This approach is called conjunctural analysis, and it emerged in the 1970s at the University of Birmingham Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies under the directorship of Stuart Hall. Conjunctural analysis was developed in response to theoretical debates occurring in British Marxism over the role that the economy has in determining other aspects of a society: the political, technological, social, cultural, ideological, and for us, the intimate. Against vulgar Marxism, which held that the economy determines all other aspects of a society, conjunctural analysis sees each of these aspects as having equal capacity to shape each other in complex and unpredictable ways. The point of conjunctural analysis is to work out how these different aspects of society are shaping each other at a given moment in time, or historical conjuncture. In cultural studies, this is often done by analysing a particular cultural formation, which has emerged during a particular conjuncture. Different subcultures, media panics, forms of pop music are just some of the cultural formations that have been subject to conjunctural analysis. Taking this approach allows us to consider not only the historical significance of these cultural formations, but also the shape and direction that the society in which they've emerged is moving in at a particular moment in time. Cultures of intimacy, smartphone mediated or otherwise, are rarely the subject of conjunctural analysis. However, we've found this approach beneficial in a number of ways. The benefit most relevant to today's discussion is that this conjunctural approach includes but moves beyond an exclusive focus on the platforms and technologies through which these intimacies are mediated. It also encourages us to look outside an exclusive focus on queer social and cultural histories, which are so often the analytical frames used to make sense of these men's social and cultural practices. Instead, conjunctural analysis foregrounds the fact that queer men inhabit the world as much as any other social group, albeit from a specific social location. And their cultures of intimacy and the way they are mediated are therefore shaped by a wide range of social forces. This has allowed us to see how queer men's smartphone-mediated cultures of intimacy are shaped by wider conjunctural dynamics, not often included in the analysis of these cultures, giving us a different understanding of their significance for queer men, as well as the world that they inhabit. To explain how we use conjunctural analysis, I will very briefly gloss over the methods we adopted, and we're more than happy to elaborate on these in the discussion after. So the project has 3 work packages. Work package 1 explored the material conditions in which queer men use their smartphones to negotiate their cultures of intimacy. For instance, the technological infrastructures of their mediation, the physical spaces where the negotiations take place, and the broader economic and political conditions which shape them. Work package 2 analysed how these cultures were represented in popular culture. We performed discourse analysis of representations of queer men's smartphone-mediated intimacies on TV, film, and social media. And in work package 3, we interviewed 43 queer men about how they use their smartphones to negotiate these cultures. The interviews were qualitative, in-depth, and semi-structured. And this slide represents the demographic breakdown of our sample of queer men. As you can see, we've done our best to be as to create as diverse a sample as possible. The analysis brings the work packages together. So, our findings. 2 major themes have emerged from our research. The first theme is vulnerability. We opened every interview that we did with the question, what does intimacy mean to you? And a striking number of our participants answered by using the word vulnerability. Here are some examples. Thomas says, vulnerability is the key to intimacy for me. Miguel, I think intimacy is you being comfortable with your vulnerabilities with another person. Gavin, mutual vulnerability. Abadisi defines intimacy as ritualized vulnerability. And Luca says, I think I'm experiencing intimacy when I'm really putting myself out there and feeling vulnerable. These quotes refer to the whole range of intimacy practiced by our participants, whether they were talking about monogamous, open, or polyamorous relationships, dates, casual or regular hookups, or platonic friendships. Whatever form our participants practiced, many of them talked about those practices in relation to vulnerability. The second theme relates to control. When our participants talked about how they use their smartphones to negotiate their cultures of intimacy, many of them told us that they used the different functions of their phone in ways that gave them a sense of control over the areas of their intimate lives where they felt most vulnerable. So this quote from interviewee Luca sums up this theme very concisely. He says, I see this with my boyfriends, where the topic is really important, but represents something for someone that is vulnerable. They would prefer to reach me on WhatsApp because they are more in control on when to stop and when to post, when they have more time to think about their words. Many other participants concurred, talking about the various features of their phones, the camera, different hookup and social media applications, MSM, voice notes, etc., to get a feeling of control over different aspects of their intimate lives. For example, Peter started to use hookup apps anonymously so that he could feel more in control of his coming out process, carefully approaching fellow users to start conversations, and then finally adding a face picture to his profiles when he felt ready to be publicly gay. Some talked about controlling the pace of their intimate encounters. Will liked to be able to decide when to send the men that he met on Grindr his phone number, so the relationship could, in his words, graduate to WhatsApp. Some talked about controlling their image. Joe uses a wheelchair and talks about wanting to have control over when he reveals this part of his life, so does not include a picture where his wheelchair is visible on his hookup app profiles. Gareth relished being able to use the chat functions of different social media apps to establish the boundaries of the BDSM encounters that he enjoyed organizing. Many of our trans math participants, as well as the men of color we spoke to, described using the block and report functions of different apps as a way of feeling in control of the racism and transphobia they experienced on these applications, something that James and Ingrid will be discussing in detail shortly. Before I start talking about these findings conjuncturally, I want to make a couple of points about how they contrast with existing research on and popular perceptions of queer men's cultures of intimacy. So the first relates to how intimacy is defined in the academic scholarship. Ken Plummer defines intimacy as innermost thoughts and feelings. Lynn Jameson as relationships which are often described as the most important to people. Lauren Ballant defined intimacy as connections that people depend on for living. And our own Shaka McGlotten, who's here tonight, as the affective encounters with others that often matter most. The term vulnerability does occasionally appear in this scholarship, but mostly as a secondary term. Two of the most prominent writers to think about intimacy and vulnerability together are Anne Chektovich and Catherine Angel, both of whom write about women and intimacy. It's rare that the two terms come together in work on queer men, and yet it was the most common way that our participants defined intimacy. This leads on to the second point. The primary association made by our participants between intimacy and vulnerability and their use of smartphones to gain a sense of control over this vulnerability contradicts the pervasive popular stereotypes of queer men's cultures of sex and intimacy. This stereotype has it that out of control queer men use hookup apps to ferociously accumulate as many meaningless casual sexual encounters as possible, often with damaging consequences for their mental health. There is little room for a term like vulnerability within this conception of queer men's cultures of sex and intimacy. And this may be the case for some queer men, but our findings show precisely the opposite. That being vulnerable with another person was critical to their understandings of their intimate lives, whichever type of intimacy they desired, including, for some, anonymous sex. And they use different aspects of their smartphones to make them feel like they are more in control as they negotiate these cultures. The key question for us, given the approach we've taken, is why has this way of defining intimacy and of using smartphones emerged in this way now? What can this cultural formation tell us about queer men's lives and the conjuncture they inhabit? To answer these questions, I'm going to put what our interviewees said into conversation with queer theory and some contemporary conjunctural analysis. Interestingly, control and vulnerability are key terms across both sets of literature, although vulnerability comes out more through the concept of sovereignty, or to be precise, non-sovereignty. The term sovereignty means a state of having power or authority over something. In the queer theory literature on intimacy, the term non-sovereignty is used to refer to the fact that we never have full power or authority over our subjectivity or our sense of self, because our subjectivities are constituted by our relationships to the people and objects that we desire intimacy with. We believe that achieving intimacy with others will help us master the unsettling experience of non-sovereignty and make us feel complete. This, however, is a fantasy, or what some queer theorists call the fantasy of sovereignty. The romantic discourse of idealized marriage is a fantasy of sovereignty, as is the 1960s idea of sexual liberation. These discourses offer us a sense that our intimate practices can, in different ways, fulfill us and make us feel whole. Many queer theorists, especially those who theorize queer men's sexual cultures, such as Leo Bassani and Lee Edelman, think this fantasy of sovereignty is, to put it very crudely, bad, precisely because it's a fantasy. Intimate relationships can never make us feel complete. We are fundamentally non-sovereign subjects. For those scholars accepting and inhabiting our non-sovereignty as fully as we can is the ideal ethical position. As I've just said, non-sovereignty explicitly becomes vulnerability in the works of Anne Chektovich, who draws on Leo Bassani in an essay on butch femme lesbian intimacies, and also in Catherine Angel's recent book, Tomorrow's Sex Will Be Good Again, which is about heterosexual women. As Angel writes, in all sex, we are quintessentially vulnerable. And for Chektovich, the experience of being vulnerable is both welcome and difficult, and hence profoundly transformative. The notion of control that was so prevalent amongst our participants is completely at odds with this theorization of vulnerability and non-sovereignty. It is a fantasy of sovereignty that you can exercise control in your intimate life in any meaningful way. These writers, one imagines, would caution against our participants using their smartphones to gain a sense of control over the parts of their intimate lives where they felt most vulnerable. Indeed, Kane Race does this very thing in Reflections on Gay Men's Hookup app use, which he argues furnish users with the promise of control over their erotic engagements. He ends these reflections expressing concern that this promise of control forecloses the possibilities of more diverse, experimental, and transformative cultures of intimacy. Before I reflect any further on the ethics of vulnerability and control, I want to move the discussion to a more conjunctural register and ask, why are queer men defining intimacy in terms of vulnerability and using their smartphones to gain control over this vulnerability now? What is it about the present historical conjuncture that would produce this particular formation of smartphone-mediated intimacy? Excuse me. In political theorist Paolo Gibaldo's recently published book, he argues that the discursive horizon of the present conjuncture is defined by the triad of sovereignty, control, and protection, the master signifiers of our era. Our culture's current preoccupation with, for our purposes, sovereignty and control has emerged, according to Gibaldo and many others, as a result of the multiple conjunctural crises we're now experiencing. These crises have come about largely due to the unraveling of neoliberalism that started in 2008 with the financial crisis, but intensified after the global rise of populism, as in the words of Gibaldo, the negation of neoliberalism, which manifested itself in Britain through the Brexit vote. Since its inception, the neoliberal project has always had popular sovereignty in its sights, seeking to replace the control that democratically accountable public institutions give us with privatized free markets. It's precisely neoliberalism's deepening of non-sovereignty that has led to the desire for more sovereignty, which found its hegemonic expression in the Leave campaign's era-defining slogan, "Take back control." Other writers point to the economic precarity experienced by so many of us under neoliberalism, especially after the crash and the austerity measures introduced in response. Judith Butler has famously defined precarity as the unequal distribution of vulnerability. Our collective sense of unequally distributed vulnerability has only intensified during the coronavirus conjuncture, especially for those of us designated as belonging to vulnerable groups, in which there have been mostly unsuccessful attempts to, in the words of another famous government slogan, control the virus. So from our perspective, the appearance of vulnerability and control in our project is not just evidence of the ontological operations of intimacy or just how intimacy works. It also points to the conjunctural intensification of non-sovereignty that has come in the wake of neoliberalism's unraveling, how much more vulnerable it has made us feel, and the sense of control that so many of us desire as a result. The queer men we spoke to inhabit this conjuncture as much as anyone else, and that this structure of feeling should pervade their experiences of intimacy makes sense from the perspective of conjunctural analysis. There are, however, specific ways that queer men and other queer communities have been made to feel more vulnerable in the current conjuncture. Much has been made in recent cultural analysis of how white, cis, able-bodied, educationally and economically privileged gay men have benefited from the neoliberal settlement and its attendant politics of homonormativity. We don't disagree, but our research shows a more complex picture for even these men, let alone queer men with less capital, queer trans men, queer men of colour, and queer men living with disabilities. For instance, a neoliberal economy geared towards property speculation, combined with austerity measures and pandemic restrictions, have led to the reduction and closures of the spaces that different queer communities have historically relied on to feel safe or indeed less vulnerable. Bars, nightclubs, sex on premises venues, other community spaces, and sexual health services. A key feature of our crisis-ridden conjuncture has been the so-called culture wars, which have been defined by sustained and highly visible attacks on trans folk and people of colour who are engaged in various political struggles to make their lives more livable. The recent emergence of the Black Trans Lives Matter movement being exemplary of both. The media debates over trans bodily sovereignty, indeed the very fact of trans existence, is central to these attacks. This has on and offline dimensions, with persistent trolling of trans folk and people of colour across a range of online platforms, including from queer men on hookup apps, and a related rise in reports of violence against all categories of the LGBTQ+ spectrum, including white cis gay men and women. Homophobia has not been exhausted as a social force, despite the political games made in the name of cis gay men and women. So while certain queer theorists make a compelling case for accepting our non-sovereignty, we do sympathise with our participants' desire for control in their smartphone-mediated intimacies during a crisis-ridden conjuncture defined by the general intensification of non-sovereignty. In a time of multiple political crises, when so much feels out of control, there is a logic in trying to exercise more control in one of the few areas left where you think you can, even if it's an unrealizable fantasy. In these concluding remarks, it will be useful to pass the meaning of vulnerability a little further. In Catherine Angel's work, the meaning of vulnerability slides between the vulnerability we might want to feel in our intimate encounters and the vulnerability to violence that overlap in particular ways for heterosexual women. Both forms of vulnerability have the capacity to undo us, but with obviously very different implications. Whilst I wouldn't want to conceptually untangle these overlapping meanings entirely, I do want to note that the sort of control that queer theorists caution against is clearly different to the desire for control over the violence you might face in your search for intimacy, racist, transphobic, homophobic, or otherwise. We're sure these scholars wouldn't disagree. It's just this distinction is not often explicitly made in the literature on these questions. In his work on contemporary politics, Giobaldo makes the distinction between reactionary and progressive forms of sovereignty. The sovereignty over national borders being an example of the former, and democratic sovereignty being an example of the latter. I wonder if we might take a similar approach in our discussions of intimacy, and that there might be certain ethically acceptable desires for sovereignty in this domain. These would be organized through the distinction, not always easily made, between being undone by intimacy's affective intensities and being undone by the violences we might face, indeed that some of us face more in its pursuit, as well as an attention to how both shift from conjuncture to conjuncture. As an example, as I've just said, the shape and direction of the current conjuncture have in part been defined by contestations over the sovereignty that trans people and people of colour can exercise over their own lives. These contestations have had very specific effects on how queer men have used their smartphones to negotiate their cultures of intimacy. And I'll now hand over to James and Ingrid to show how. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. I think I'll go next, James, I think that's what we planned. So I'm Dr. Ingrid Young, and let me see if I can work the technical. It's kind of ironic to have a presentation on a project on digital intimacies when I am particularly rubbish at managing the digital world. So if you see, hopefully you see my slides and you see my screen, you can let me know if there's anything you shouldn't see. That would be fantastic. So I'm going to talk to you really quite briefly. I'm just going to touch on where we got to with thinking about race and racism in relation to the findings that we did. So as Jamie mentioned, we did a number of interviews. He put the slide up with the range of people that we interviewed 43 people in total, and of those, I think there were 11, I've got the numbers on the slide, but a handful were queer men of color. And so I'll talk to those kind of issues that emerged in relation to that in this project. Let me see if I can work my, okay. So when we think about race and researching race, so we didn't explicitly seek out to research race explicitly. We wanted to understand, we wanted to think about how queer men broadly engage with digital cultures, with smartphones, etc., as James explained. But we did want to explicitly include queer men of color in the study, and to make sure that we really got more than kind of one or two people. These studies of queer men, of gay and bisexual men, of queer men, tend to be dominated by white, cis, middle-class, London-based gay men, as you all probably know. So we tried really hard to think about how to include different men that we might not have heard from before, or that we wouldn't normally include in a study like this. So we made some decisions about how to recruit, who to recruit with. Where we initially decided we were going to it was initially going to be split evenly between Scotland and London, and decided to recruit more heavily from London because of the makeup, because of we were keen to include more people of color as well as other people. But I think we also note the limitations of our ability to do this effectively. So there's 3 cis white identifying possibly, but researchers. James and I did the recruitment and the interviews. We recognize the limits of this, and a study that might have focused explicitly on queer men of color may present very different findings, and I think that's important for us to consider in terms of methodologically. I know I'm not talking about methods here, it's not a room full of sociologists, so I won't go on about that, but I think it's important to reflect on kind of the possibilities and the limitations of this work. We sought to, though, in the research that we did, to pay attention to how and where race and ethnicity played or shaped or framed intimate practices within communities of color, or even alongside. As I mentioned before, we interviewed, I think, let's say, sorry, my maths, 14 people who didn't identify as white explicitly, although we asked people to self-describe. We have collapsed some of those definitions to protect anonymity, but we have a mixture of people who identified as Black, South Asian, Southeast Asian, and mixed. And again, mixed was very much how they self-identified. So we'll pay attention to this data in particular. And this is just a shout out to, I don't know if he's here, but Lewis Clark, who's been working with us over the past 4 months on the data analysis. So a lot of this work has been in conversation with James, Jamie, and myself, but also with Lewis Clark and with Lauren. So a shout out to Lewis for his work on this. One of the main things that we found really was thinking about how there were increased discussions or reflections on whiteness and racism in the context of Black Lives Matter. These interviews took place in 2020, smack in the middle of everything that was happening. So there's a lot we could say about pandemics. There's a lot we could say about Black Lives Matter, probably a lot we could say about Brexit, but I am not talking about that today. But I think what it meant was that there was quite a lot of reflection amongst some participants about race and racism and whiteness and rights. And so that comes through to an extent, although I won't be focusing on that. Like I said, I think this is an initial kind of reflection on race and racism within the data specifically. So one of the first things I'd like to talk about briefly is about how the participants we spoke to talked about presenting digital identities, and how most of the queer men of color that we spoke to thought quite a lot about how they presented on apps and more generally, and that this required reflection, consideration, and careful curation. And this is perhaps not a surprise to many of you that people think about how they present themselves on apps, but I think the way in which a lot of the queer men of color talked about thinking not just about kind of what they're into or kind of how they appear, but how they name themselves and what implications that has. A lot of the participants anticipated the whiteness of digital spaces. So we're speaking to a space that they imagined would be primarily comprised of other white queer men and how they responded to that. There was some variation across platforms. As you can imagine, Grindr was seen as very different to Scruff, and again, some variation of that. A lot of the men that we spoke to did talk about how they use these apps and presenting themselves as ways to connect with other queer men of color. And I think that's really important to reflect on, that race and racism well, racism is about exclusion, but thinking about how race functions as ways to connect rather than just to exclude. And then consideration of places and spaces, obviously more rural spaces, more smaller spaces, there were different practices and different ways of presenting, and also different ways of having to explain yourself. And an example of this is Raj, who was South Asian, based in Scotland, and talked about how he presented himself as South Asian, and talked about how people needed to know that. So he included that in his list. He said, I'm 39 years old, Asian, some hair, jock geek, I'm into jocks, muscles, daddies, otters, that all I've put. But he goes on to talk about how he's had multiple conversations with folks around being surprised that he is Scottish and South Asian. I don't entirely understand that, but that might be just where I live in Scotland. But I think that there's an anticipation that he has to put that out there in anticipation of or expectation of certain comments and certain discussions. I'd like to also think about the way in which ethnicity filters or technologies of racism function. And I think that, again, as I said at the start, Black Lives Matter played a really important role in elevating public discussions of racism and allyship. I think the queer men of color we talked to, obviously we're used to talking about race and racism before Black Lives Matter came along, but it changed the kind of dynamic and the kind of maybe the awareness of racism or the space to reflect on racism. And I think in terms of allyship and what allyship is, there was obviously a lot of response in relation to the ethnicity filter on Grindr, for instance, and I'd like to think about how these technologies, the apps, the phones, can be technologies of racism. So I talked at the beginning about excluding or including people and making connections, but they are still also very much technologies of racism and exclusion. And an example of this is David, who identified as a mixed bisexual cis man. Again, we ask people to self-identify, and I think that it's important to give people that space to self-identify, but that also means that there's limited maybe access to how people identify or how we think about that. But David talks about he was reflecting on Black Lives Matter, and I'll read this out really briefly, and he talked about how people were posting stuff about Black Lives Matter on Grindr, and he put up that it was going around Twitter, and he said, well, there's a petition. How can you stand by Black Lives Matter when you have an ethnicity filter? So he was talking explicitly about Grindr having, you know, making a stand, but there being an ethnicity filter. And he says they then removed it, I think, which is great. And then some people I know who are other ethnic minorities were like, it's actually good because it means you can filter out people to see of your own race. You can meet other South Asian men in the country who's on Grindr, and that's a fair point. The ethnicity filter is behind a paywall, and I don't know anybody who pays for Grindr Unlimited or Extra, so it's more metaphorical. If people are paying for Grindr, aren't paying for it, then you're not actually using the filter. Maybe these people are paying for it, I don't know, but it's abhorrent, that option. It's terrible, so I'm glad they removed it. But they only removed it when people were complaining they don't actually care. But at the same time, if racists want to weed me out and not talk to me, I want them to do that. So it serves a purpose. But I think the context of the ethnicity filter on a dating and hookup app in 2020 is ridiculous and very outdated. So I know there is a whole range of comments I can hear through the screen, your kind of eagerness to talk about this issue because it was such a big issue. But I think what this extract says to me, and what David's story says, is actually he's working through, as I think a lot of our participants were, the ways in which these technologies these technologies serve both to include and exclude, and how they are used and where they are used is important for us to consider and to reflect on. I'll briefly touch on ideas around navigating digital forms of racism. Apologies, I don't know if you can hear the sirens in the background. I think, and I put quiet racism here as a more of a question than as a comment, and I'd like us to reflect on that a little bit, because I think obviously racism emerges in all sorts of different ways, but through these apps and through these platforms, I think it's important to reflect on. So I think our participants, some of the participants talked about being fetishized or becoming a fetish, and the problems with that. Some of our participants talked about rejection, so actually people not responding, and others talked about blockings, which I mean, Jamie alluded to this in the first part of the presentation, where he talked about how queer men of color and trans men also use the blocking feature as protection. But here I'd like to reflect on how these forms were used against queer men of color, and what they thought about that. So the first extract is from Stephen, who talked about the lack of response and how it was the first picture you see. So he said he'd seen profiles that really shocked him. People were very openly saying no Asians, and then in brackets, sorry you guys, or British guys only. And he described how it was really shocking that people could feel confident enough to have that level of security, and that he found the environment, just even having those, a very toxic and an aggressive way of being. So he felt and described that it was a way where these apps could be a way to connect people. What they're actually really doing is separating everyone, as he explains. And then Nye talks about, not about the rejection, the kind of outward kind of rejection, but more the subtle, or maybe perhaps a different form of rejection. So he was talking about being blocked, and that actually people just will block you. And he described one example where there were a group of them, and they were looking at their phones just to show each other what it was like, and that a lot of the kind of people he was with could see certain people on Grindr, whereas he and this other guy who was Black couldn't see these people to see. So they actually saw on the phones how they were being blocked, how they were being excluded by people in the general vicinity. And he said he was really struck by this, because normally you wouldn't see this if you were, not normally, but if you were on your own, or if you weren't comparing, you might not see this. So I think when I raise the issue of invisible racism, I think it's who is it visible to, and how, and in what context we need to think about. So really briefly, and I'll wrap up, because I know I know James we'd like to hear from James. Thinking about witnessing racism or reflecting on whiteness. So a lot of the participants who identified as white had very little to say about racism in digital spaces. It was that silence was quite deafening. I think, not deafening, that silence was quite striking, I think, in terms of how certain participants, often those who were identified as people of color or otherwise, had a lot to say about it, but that there was very little discussion when we think about privilege and rejection with other participants. Some did reflect on their own positionality in whiteness. There were a handful that did, and talked about how they might be sometimes unknowingly complicit with the racism within these spaces. And I just want to end with a discussion about Max. Max was he identified as white mixed. He's a queer trans man, and he talked about how he was a friend of his was South Asian. They had a very similar build, they had a very similar kind of profile, and how there were often men would approach Max, men would message Max on the apps, but they wouldn't approach his friend Ash. And so he reflected quite a lot on, he saw this racism because of his friend and because of these experiences, and he wondered about his complicity in this. And so he says he tries not to put race on the apps. And he talks about how he might be identified as he might not be English, or he might be asked about where he's from. So the way in which the visual kind of really plays on how race is identified in certain people and in certain settings. But he said he didn't want to put race on his apps because, and on his descriptions, because he says, well, if someone thinks I'm not white and they're put off by that, then I don't want to reassure them. And he said, and although those apps allow you to search by race, I don't want to come up on somebody who's just searched for white people. So he didn't at all want to be complicit in that. And he talked quite a lot about how he reflected on who's contacting me, and having witnessed a lot of these kind of forms of exclusion, what is his role in this? And so I've put quite a long quote up. I won't go on about that, but I think it's important to think about, so where we see this, so we don't see these forms of racism on these apps and within these digital spaces, how is it that people are trying to respond to that, or are trying to navigate these digital forms, and where is it that they're trying to counter this and to think about that? I'm going to end here because I think we could go on, and I'd be really keen to hear what others thought about this. This was kind of not the conjunctural analysis that Jamie so beautifully presented, so we can have a further discussion about this. But now I'll hand over to James, who's going to talk about trans and non-binary participants. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ingrid. So I'll just share my screen now. Okay, good. So hopefully everyone can see my slides now. That's great. Good. So yeah, like Ingrid said, I'm going to be talking specifically about some of the experiences of our trans and non-binary participants. I think a couple of caveats, I think some of which Ingrid's already covered a bit to go through before I start, but I wanted to say that we're still at a kind of early stage with our analysis. So what I'm presenting is kind of still emerging themes. Again, I think it's also important to note that we are a team of cisgender researchers, and we acknowledge that this is problematic given the history of the exclusion of trans and non-binary folk from research about trans and non-binary experience. We will be involving trans individuals and groups in our analysis through a community analysis workshop, but we still recognise that our analysis may be shaped by our own gender identities, and we're open to any and all comments and feedback. I also want to emphasise that while we do want to attend to struggles and joys that are specific to our trans and non-binary participants, we also remain cautious not to overemphasize differences or to construct a strict cis-trans binary. Much of what we're finding through the project is common to both our cis, trans and non-binary participants alike, including the ways that digital intimacies are gendered and are shaped by discourses of masculinity and femininity. And at the same time, experiences also differ along axes not only of gender, but also race, ethnicity, class, disability, embodiment, and their intersections. Okay, so having said that, it's also clear that for our trans and non-binary participants, gender identities, discourses, boundaries, and fluidities were often primary factors that shape their experiences of seeking and maintaining intimacy in digital settings, while the gendering of digital intimacies tended to be more implicit or taken for granted amongst our cis participants. So all of our trans and non-binary participants spoke of initial hesitancy when they first started using their phones to find and connect with other queer men. So apps such as Grindr and Scruff and Hinge were recognized as predominantly occupied by and marketed towards cis men. This meant that our trans and non-binary participants were often unsure about whether these spaces were for them, how inclusive or transphobic they might be, and what possibilities they would present for providing nourishing, intimate connections. Now, as Elliot explained in the quote that you can see here, they said, Grindr was quite a stressful place to be because I wasn't as confident or secure in my sense of self, and there was a lot more transphobic behavior. So there was a period of time where I had all those apps, but I was quite tentative about using them. So cis-normativity was inherent across most of the hookup apps that were discussed by our participants, where default assumptions amongst the majority of cis users was that other users were also cis. This means that trans and non-binary folk were often othered in these spaces and were concerned with questions of whether and how to disclose their trans identities and how others might react. So within these cis-normative contexts, many of our trans and non-binary participants discuss their preferences for foregrounding their gender identities on their digital profiles. This was seen as a way of mitigating possible risks of transphobic violence and of managing the expectations of other users who might read them as cis men. As Jacob noted, as a trans guy, for my own safety, I would out myself to guys before meeting them. All sorts of things would then happen, either invasive questions or some sort of invalidating remarks or obsessive curiosity. So while participants did discuss explicitly transphobic abuse that they had received online, experiences of fetishization were more common. As Alex described the common experience of being asked invasive questions about their body, their sexual practices, and their pre-transition identities. For Alex, such questions were not necessarily malicious, but the way that they can come across is extremely malicious. People asking about my junk is not relevant unless I want them to see it, and those are big questions. And as Alex continued, I understand how cock-centric Grindr is and how genital-centric the entire scene is, and I think that I've had to be careful. I was on Grindr for a couple of weeks before I was like, should I have a six-pack? Will that add to my value as a person? So importantly here, Alex connects their specific experience of objectification as a non-binary person to broad dynamics of gender normativity and the idealization of a particular form of muscular hypermasculinity that was discussed by many of our participants. It's both cis and trans alike. Concerns about safety and the need for caution in digital interactions also speak to the general ways that our participants recognize themselves as vulnerable, as Jamie discussed earlier. So while transphobia, objectification, and fetishization in digital settings were common, these were not the primary focus of our interviews. And in fact, most of our trans and non-binary participants reflected quite positively on their experiences of digital intimacy. In particular, many talked about their experiences of a growing confidence in using their phones to connect with other queer men, alongside a growing confidence in their own masculine identifications. And Thomas described this when he said, I was at a place in my transition that I started to feel comfortable exploring that aspect of my sexuality. I was able to create the life that I wanted and to start exploring that. And it was almost like a coming of age thing. There was no one telling me I can't do this. I think prior to that, I didn't really allow myself to be interested in men at all. I think because it was almost like I don't feel like a man, so gay men are off limits. It wasn't until I was able to start actually seeing myself as a man and living that way and being perceived that way by other people that I felt comfortable even to start using spaces like Grindr and Scruff. The digital spaces and interactions were also valued for the relative safety and greater degrees of control over information and interaction that they offered when compared to in-person encounters. Several participants discussed making their trans and non-binary identities explicit on their digital profiles as a means of taking control over information and interactions and weeding out transphobes. As Elliot explained, say you meet someone on a night out, for example, and you decide that maybe you might want to hook up. There then has to be this conversation about like, I'm trans, this is what that means. Whereas when you use apps, it's like, I can just say all of that and it already weeds out the transphobes quite quickly because they just don't engage. Or if they do engage, I can be like, no. It's also like a safety thing. It means I'm not putting myself in a situation where somebody's going to sort of freak out about it. So in this way, digital spaces can afford greater agency to trans men and non-binary folk in deciding who to interact with and how those interactions unfold. Of course, not everyone felt this way. Jacob disliked what he felt to be excessive talking, discussing, and asking about his identity and his body in online conversations. He preferred to meet intimate partners at saunas and through cruising, where the visibility of bodies removed the need for the verbal communication of mutual attraction. As Jacob put it, the etiquette is such in the sauna that you just don't talk to people you're not interested in. He also recognized the trans-inclusive sauna that he visited in Edinburgh as a safe space where staff would intervene if he were to encounter violence. Jack was also concerned with transphobic violence, and for this reason, while he was using his phone to arrange hookups, he preferred to meet in his own home, where he felt that he felt more comfortable and that he was more in control. So these accounts suggest that there's no necessary relationship between safety and the pursuit of intimacy in either online or offline settings. Participants were variously engaging in practices that they felt reduced their risks of harm, whether by weeding out transphobes online before meeting, making use of sex on premises venues, controlling who they allow into their homes, or a host of other strategies. We recognize such concerns as part of the general discussions of vulnerability and control, which have emerged as key themes across all of our interviews. So Jacob's account of his exhaustion with having to repeatedly explain his identity and his body to cis men online was echoed by many of our trans and non-binary participants. In contrast to initial experiences of gender affirmation, as time had passed, many participants had become jaded with ignorance towards gender and bodily diversity that characterized most of their interactions on hookup apps. They developed strategies for avoiding encounters with ignorance, as Alex recounted. A lot of the time, it's tackling transphobic stuff. And if I've spent all my energy and hours of my time and somebody's blocked me, that will have taken a lot of emotional effort and nothing is going to come out of it. Like, I'm not on a hookup and I haven't enlightened anyone. I actually now have on my Scruff bio, currently not teaching Trans 101. I just don't want those questions. I'm not there to educate other people. I'm there for the reason everyone else is. I would sometimes have in my bio, mainly trans for trans, or be like, I'm more picky about cis dudes, kind of as a warning. So Alex went on to describe how they'd established important connections with other trans and non-binary folk. And while such connections were often established through cis-dominated hookup apps, they tended to be maintained through more specific digital settings, such as WhatsApp groups or Facebook groups, like the one that Alex describes here, as somewhere just for trans folk, where everyone posts the nonsense screenshots that they get. It's a really good way to share, to vent, and to educate. I think that if someone was quite new to Grindr and quite young, but they were still in that Facebook group, they would learn quite quickly, oh yeah, I don't have to put up with this stuff. Look at these people who are confident. Such spaces and relationships were a vital source of solidarity, belonging, and information, as well as sexual pleasure. This was especially the case in light of the limitations on in-person interactions during the COVID-19 pandemic and in relation to the disappearance of trans-inclusive spaces amidst the gentrification and diminishment of queer bar and club scenes, particularly in London. So By way of conclusion, I'd like to relate some of these points back to the idea of conjunctural analysis that Jamie discussed earlier. And this means thinking about how the digital intimacies practiced by trans and non-binary folk are shaped by the broad historical contexts in which they occur, and how attention to those digital intimacies can help us gain a more attuned understanding of those same contexts. So firstly, we might recognize that our trans and non-binary participants are using digital spaces that have conventionally been imagined as spaces for cis gay men at a particular point in time that's characterized by the growing visibility of trans-masculine identities within gay cultural spaces. Recent examples of this from popular culture include the inclusion of Chio Gomez, a gay trans man, as a finalist in the 2021 Mr. Gay UK competition, and also the inclusion of Got Mick, a trans-masculine drag artist, in season 13 of Drag Race USA. This might suggest a loosening of the ties between gender and sexuality, and an opening up of gay spaces and the social category gay itself, where gay no longer implicitly signals cis men. It's also noteworthy that while London Pride 2020 was cancelled due to COVID-19 restrictions, a Black Trans Lives Matter march took place and was perhaps the most high-profile queer event in London that year. While this was mainly focused on the lives of trans women, it nonetheless highlights the increased visibility of intersectional identities and inequalities. Having said this, any celebration of a burgeoning trans inclusivity, gender fluidity, and a queering of gay spaces, cultures, and identities should be tempered by the evident extent to which transphobia and ignorance remain pervasive in the experience of our trans and non-binary participants. And this should be recognised in the context of a hostile media environment in the UK, which gives voice to transphobic groups, vilifies trans and non-binary people as a threat to supposed feminist, gay, and lesbian political agendas, and exaggerates minimal movements towards trans equality and inclusion, while ignoring the dismal state of trans healthcare and the extent to which trans people remain underrepresented in public institutions and experience heightened degrees of unemployment, homelessness, and domestic violence. So these struggles around trans rights and lives, gender fluidities, and attendant contestations from conservative and reactionary corners of society can be seen as a definitional facet of the current conjuncture. And they're one of the key struggles that shape our participants' smartphone-mediated intimacies. And they're also a vehicle for the expression of other social anxieties associated with the crisis-riven historical period in which we all currently live. And within these contexts, it's hardly surprising that we see our participants, on the one hand, challenging the cis-normativity of the digital spaces that they occupy, and engaging in digitally mediated explorations of their gender identities and sexual desires, while on the other hand, doing so in ways that are informed by concerns for safety, vulnerability, and desires for control over intimate interactions. And this, of course, echoes the broad concerns around control and vulnerability amongst our participants, while also bringing into how desires for control and experiences of vulnerability play out differently along intersectional lines. Okay, thank you.
Colleagues, inevitably, given the richness of the material that the team have got to share here, we're running over. So what we're proposing is that we won't have a 5-minute break. Lauren will be giving her presentation next. Hopefully Marc will be able to stay long enough, but even if he isn't able to stay long enough, I'll be passing on his comments to the team in the discussion that follows. I need to shut up because we need to get on. So over to you, Lauren.
Thanks so much. I will try and keep it very brief, everyone. Bear with me 2 seconds. Okay. Can we all see my slide? Okay, great. So I'm Lauren. I joined the Digital Intimacies team earlier this year to help in supporting the development of additional resources that would communicate our research findings in an accessible and interesting manner. We communicated with our partners on the project, Terence Higgins Trust, London Friend and Waverley Care, in order to discern what kind of outputs they felt may be most appropriate and useful for the work that they do. And we considered within that what these different outputs may be and how they can support further work and research. And from these conversations, we felt that we wanted to produce content that had a broad reach, something that spoke to the queer community broadly. We wanted it to prove useful to the third sector and to nurture and foster creative partnerships. And in that, engage excessively with our findings. So meaning that we wanted to create something that wasn't just solely text-based, which can be the case with research, such as the team have so brilliantly presented so far. And perhaps most importantly, though, we really wanted these outputs to highlight how our research complicates certain stereotypes. So in line with these objectives, what we chose to do was work with an illustrator to create and develop a fanzine, or what I'm going to be calling a zine, and a graphic designer to produce a short end of project report. Our decision to produce a fanzine was mostly informed by the desire within the team to create something that depicted our research findings in an accessible and fun way. We wanted something tangible, visual, and something that communicated complexities, visually highlighting also the diversity represented within our subject group, which Ingrid has talked a little bit, and obviously James has talked about as well. So within that, our choice of the illustrator Fedalanka, I don't know if anyone's come across him before, seemed pretty apt. He really spoke to this desire for the zine to be representative. He's a London-based artist, and he produces poignant, funny, and engaging content that tackles pertinent issues affecting the queer community. It's just worth noting as well that traditionally zines are produced and circulated free of charge, so our fanzine, in keeping with this convention, will be made available in a downloadable format. So we hope that you will circulate it and enjoy it as much as we have enjoyed producing it. So fundamentally, we wanted the fanzine narrative to engage with myths about queer men, sex, intimacy, and digital media. So we did this through developing a story around myth busting. Our interviews are represented here within the illustrations, and it's drawing on transcripts, some that highlight one particular story and others that fuse multiple stories together in accounts. As you can see, our zine starts by introducing our project team, where we all look a little bit terrifying, hopefully not too terrifying, and it provides a list of relevant references a reader may also want to access further. Each of our spreads within the zine starts with a common myth. So our first one here you can see is looking at how queer men's hookup apps is only used for sex, and has been outlined in the presentation. This is something that is actually reflected in participant narratives as more complex. What we can see in the illustrations is that hookup apps were discussed by participants as also providing a space for queer men to begin to feel comfortable with their sexuality, to open up to others and facilitate social connections between certain groups, such as migrants, and generally providing an environment to feel supported and connected to the wider queer community. The second myth that's been discussed a little bit here is the idea that apps are really designed only in mind with for white cis able-bodied gym-fit men, or we could call it insta-gay. And the illustrations here try and complicate this narrative, highlighting how, while participants have encountered problematic prejudices, they still use hookup apps, and in particular that they use them for the same reason everybody does, which is to hook up. So we've pulled out something that was mentioned in James's presentation, which is this narrative from a participant talking about how they weren't there to teach trans 101, but they were there for the same reason as everybody else, to hook up. The third myth we've presented here is that queer men's app use is out of control. And as was really nicely presented, obviously, by Jamie, this is contradicted in narratives, or at least challenged, in which participants really discuss how app use allowed them to feel more in control, to upload particular photos, to limit how they engaged with people, to also turn off or switch off when you wanted to maybe move away from prejudices. Our fourth myth here kind of it addresses the concept of the binary that exists often stereotypically, in which you're either, we've put here, walking down the aisle or going into the dark room. So either you're existing within a more heteronormative relationship, or you're kind of excessively sexual in that way. And what we've tried to draw out in these illustrations is something that complexly engages with the fact that intimacy means different things to different people. So we have a nice narrative that was represented by one participant around eyebrow threading or mutual removal of hair. We actually had the illustrator talk about an instance in which he met a friend, as you can see in the bottom left, in a sexual context. Obviously, sex wasn't on the cards, but they did develop a friendship after that, which demonstrates that difference of intimacy. Our fifth myth is talking about how queer communities harm the wider communities through casual sex, and we've really drawn upon interview data here that was exploring safety within the pandemic, and actually how safety was optimized and used by, for example, reducing the number of playmates people engaged with, and only traveling to and from and wearing masks, etc. So again, stripping away the idea that that people's use of hookup apps or that queer men's engagement through digital media is unsafe. Yeah, so that was that. Our final myth is engaging with this idea that has been spoken about briefly, is the idea that hookup apps are killing the gay scene or the physical space in which queer communities can exist. And what we've tried to do here is actually push back against that and say, you know, we really need to think about how these physical spaces are being taken over and moved in on by corporate greed and capitalism further. So we're hoping that the fanzine will prove useful to third sector audiences. We've had some brief conversations about how it might be used in a workshop setting to explore some of these discussions further. And it's worth noting that whilst our research doesn't specifically engage with sexual health, many of the issues raised in participant accounts intersect and exist within the navigation of health and sexual well-being. So this being the case, we felt it was important to include signposting for readers to these charities and organisations as well. The second output I will just very briefly go over here is the end of project report that we designed specifically with third sector audiences in mind. We wanted it to be concise, easily digestible, relatively short, and draw out the main thematic building blocks that will be expanded later in a book on the project that documents these findings. We worked with graphic designer Chris Williams to produce something that was again visually accessible and that interspersed participant quotes with relevant theory. And similarly to the fanzine, our hope is that the end of project report will be free to access and available prior to the publication of the book. And again, we hope that third sectors will be able to use this in their own work, particularly to think about how queer men are actually very adept at creatively using smartphones and digital platforms to attend to their health and well-being needs. So we feel such reflection may help to build upon and sustain better and more appropriate forms of support and care through that document. Fundamentally, and in summary, we hope that our project outputs are going to promote critical engagement. We want to highlight how the production of intimacy via smartphone use was depicted in participant accounts, not just as inherently problematic, which is often seen as the case, but joyful, fostering community and promoting safety too. And we hope to move beyond the binary of good or bad when it comes to smartphone use, and rather think about it in a complex negotiation of intimacy. And we hope that both the fanzine and the end of project report will foster and encourage wider engagement from the queer community with our research, and that they prove accessible and helpful to third sector audiences. I'll just skip over what we were going to say about Fred Alanka, but it's briefly useful to say that he has developed He's developed a queer youth art collective, which is fostering creative engagement from young people. And we felt that in partnering with such an illustrator, we were also helping to give back to the wider queer community. That's all from me. Our resources are free to access and you can find them on our website, which is below. And we are sharing content on Twitter and Instagram as well. So please feel free to find it there.
Colleagues, thanks so much for your presentations and for all of these riches. We're now going to move to 4 respondents who are just going to give their feedback on what they've heard so far and pose some questions. And I'm hoping that Marc is going to be able to stay long enough to do that. He's still here, so I think I'm living in hope. So over to you, Marc.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Ingrid, Jamie, and the rest of the team for that excellent presentation. Some really rich and interesting data there, and I think I'm really pleased to hear that Grindr isn't the death of us all. That's quite welcome to see that, and I really look forward to kind of getting the fanzine and distributing that as well. I think some of my immediate reflections, and I'm going to kind of hone in on, which may not surprise many people, I'm going to hone in on the issues of race and black and minority and black and brown men that was spoken about there. And first of all, you know, big thank you for doing the work to try to ensure that we were engaged and involved in this research, because way too often we're not, either because we don't engage with it or researchers don't do hard enough work to find us. So I'm incredibly grateful for that. I think that one of the things that really leapt out at me is that, again, this shows the diversity of our experiences as black and brown queer men who exist in the world. And it's never a one size fits all, and that racism impacts on us very, very differently. And our experiences and our age also play a huge part in that, and also where we are in the country as well. So the Southeast Asian guy in Scotland, his responses were slightly different to somebody who was in the South or in London. You know, those things really stood out for me. And I think the thing that struck me the most was the conversation around ethnicity filters on the apps as well, where some guys were absolutely, you know, hopping mad that these existed in the first place, and words like abhorrent were used, and they were really, really offensive. Where at the other end of the scale, in that same quote, the young man was saying that some men really, really welcomed that. And I think that my ask, again, if there was time and there was resource to do more research in that, it's about who we desire, right? And where does our desire sit? So if our desire as people of color is in whiteness or with white gay men, and we are blocked or we are not accepted into those spaces, it feels really, really heavy. Whereas if I am a man of color and my choice is other men of color, then the ethnicity filter on not being accepted or being blocked or rejected becomes less of an issue. And I found this out in my work and in conversations I've had in my work with younger black gay men when the ethnicity filter was removed. So some people there were like, actually, no, it is a real benefit and bonus to us to have at least this option to filter out. And that narrative around men not choosing them, men reject you on social apps for a range of reasons, sometimes nothing to do with ethnicity, something to do with HIV or your age or your gender identity or your disability, your disability. So I think that needs some more investigation as well about where those men come from. I think the second thing which stuck out for me, but didn't surprise me in the slightest, were men who identified as white not having any conversations or not engaging around race. As you said, Ingrid, the silence was deafening, but as a man of color, not surprising at all. But I think we all know that continues to play a part and be part of the problem. And I finally kind of just want to pick up on the stuff around the intersections and talking about you. I mean, James, you were there talking to people who have mixed ethnicity, who also identified as trans or non-binary. So all of these issues which intersect on our lives and have huge impacts on how we engage with digital spaces, particularly when we're looking for sex or particularly when we're looking for intimacy, that is really fascinating for me. And I suppose the final thing for me is that stuff around intimacy and sex and that notion of fetishization. So as very often as men of color, when we enter into these spaces, we are seen as sexual beings and very little else. And if we're looking for that softer, more romantic intimacy, that can be rejected, which has a huge impact on our continuation in those spaces. So I know that there are some men that will use and engage in particular apps where they don't have filters, but they know there are a larger number of black men or men of color there, and they will bypass Grindr, or they're now creating their own apps and their own digital spaces, so they don't have to go through this stuff and they don't have to jump through these hoops. So I think those are my take homes from it, and I want to thank you all for doing the work. I think it's really good. and it can really help move our conversations forward. So thank you for that. And those are my comments.
Marc, I'm sure Ingrid will want to come back on a few of the things that you've
I can
said.
say.
But, I mean, first, I think we should all collectively thank you for the incredible work that you've been doing over several years. I'm really conscious that there might be some people in this room who don't know the work that you do and don't know who you are, Marc Thompson. So could you just quickly introduce yourself and give us a bit of a plug for the Love Tank, maybe?
Sure. So I'm Marc Thompson. I'm the director of the LoveTank, a community interest company that works to address the health inequalities and health needs of marginalised communities through health promotion, advocacy and research. And I'm also a co-founder of Prepster.info. I was previously involved in Blackout UK, which is a digital and physical space created specifically to provide options for Black queer men to connect. I live with HIV openly, have done for 35 years. I'm an activist and a bit of a social disruptor. I like to describe myself as, and I've most recently become a podcaster and have launched a big new podcast called We Were Always Here, which tells the story of the UK epidemic through unheard voices. So Black and brown people, lots and lots of women, trans communities and sex workers, and some of us old heads who you probably haven't seen or heard for in a while. So that's me.
Cheers, Marc. And I'm sure you know how much love there is in the room for you. Ingrid, do you want to come back on any of the things that Marc had to say?
Just to say thank you, Marc. We will continue to have these conversations. I think your questions around who we as in Black and brown men desire, where desire sits. I think there are maybe some methodological limitations to the work we've done. So I think I look forward to talking to you about the kind of what our participants said, but I also think the research that you're calling for, who should be doing that research and how can they be supported. So I think kind of I'm not the person to maybe the right person to be doing that research. I think that there are other people and I think we can have conversations about that. So I think thank you for the points that you raised. I think I look forward to our continued conversations on this topic. So thank you.
Always a pleasure, Ingrid, anytime.
I'd now like to open the floor in a very grand manner to Shaka McGlotten. Shaka, do you want to introduce yourself? It's a little bit pompous, me introducing you all.
Sure. My name is Shaka McGlotten. I am a professor of anthropology and media studies at Purchase College, which is just outside New York City. And I've been doing work on digital intimacies since about the turn of the millennium. So it's been a minute. And I was really happy to hear all of the presentations today, and I have a few thoughts. So what do we mean by intimacy? I think what the presentations really add are empirical, they add to the kind of empirical repertoire of what we mean by smartphone mediated intimacies. And Jamie helpfully pointed us to some queer theorists, thanks for the shout out, who have tried to answer this question. And points out that vulnerability is often missing from their or our definitions, but not from the interview data with your participants. So this raises central questions related, as you noted, Jamie, to control and sovereignty, with some additional references to the theoretical literature that asks how much control we really have. So I admit to being in the camp of the non-sovereign, but that doesn't mean that one isn't always working hard to keep it together on and offline, though the differences seem blurrier all the time. Discussions of non-sovereignty are closely tied to the fantasies of neoliberalism. Under these ideologies, we better be in control because economic forces are out to get us or have already got us got. I doubt that neoliberalism as such mattered much to your interlocutors, but it does seem to me that they are attuned to some of the ways that these virtually mediated spaces operate in economic terms, and in ways that do underscore their individual personal responsibility, even if it's something that's configured preemptively in relation to others. So in other words, these moments where all of the anticipation that goes into constructing a profile or being online or how to relate to others, I'm really interested in that. So I wonder if you could say more about it. And also I'm interested in these conceptions of abundance versus scarcity, which again, even if we can see all of the various ways that value is being cultivated online. I'm interested in the ways that that value either exceeds or falls short of this notion of the nourishing connection. So that was part one. Speaking of neoliberalism, it's been nearly a decade since I published shameless self-plug, Virtual Intimacies, and I'm still preoccupied with what mediated intimacies mean and how they work. So there are a panoply of utilities, right? Including meeting others or feeling connected, which I think that the zine that Lauren, that you showed is so great. It's is really highlighting the productive aspects, the ways that queer culture is being produced, and that this kind of productivity cannot be reduced to economic output, but is about the very act of world building. But I remain especially intrigued by practices of browsing or otherwise dwelling in what I think of as machinic time. So I think about all the time we spend online that we're not connecting or that we're not connected. So when is using these apps not about connecting, or rather, what are some of the different ways that not connecting might also matter? So discussions of vulnerability and control always implies the presence of others, but often these can be solo affairs or ones navigated largely with machinic agents. So what happens to vulnerability and control in these temporalities, right? Where we're interacting, but not necessarily with one another. And we might be interacting with AIs or bots. And this leads me to my last comment question. So I understand that platform politics, like the politics of a specific platform, are not central to your analyses, but I do wonder about your speculation about what some of the platforms afford and what they don't afford, and what and how these affordances affect what kinds of intimacies are made possible. So this has already been discussed a little bit, but this removal of the ethnicity search filter, right? It creates new limits on how people might connect, both positive and negative, as the interviewee noted. I'm struck by how this contrasts with the elaboration in some of these platforms of gender categories. So now one can find or not trans people, but not other Black people. So given the importance and visibility of Black trans lives matters, I think this is a rich avenue for future research, one that can underscore both these neoliberal or otherwise economic tensions and the intimate possibilities and impossibilities that are afforded by smartphones. Thanks.
Thanks, Shaka. So quite a range of stuff there. I'm thinking, Jamie, you're the person who will want to respond to at least some of those things.
Sure. Thank you, Shaka. That's a lot of big questions that I'm trying to process and come back to. So hopefully I've understood you correctly. So it seems that you were saying that it's actually partly the logics of neoliberalism which might be producing the kind of controlled subject, and with their interactions, kind of something about profile building and something about the way they use the platforms as a means of control could itself be an expression of neoliberalism. Have I understood you correctly in that?
So I think there's two aspects of it. One, I think even a discourse of vulnerability is part of a larger discourse of intimacy that is in circulation, that we can tie to neoliberal models of intimacy and what that means. But I think also that even if neoliberalism as such is not like the most important sort of aspect or angle, people are still understanding their relations and the potential intimacies they might have through these neoliberal lenses. And I think you pointed out in your comments earlier, right, that given such neoliberal conditions, it's understandable that people would seek to have control. And this is why I fall in the non-sovereign camp. Is like I would say that control is slippery at best.
Yeah, I mean, okay, well, just the immediate thing that comes to mind is that I don't know that we're not part of the non-sovereign camp. What we're doing what I was doing in that particular, in the presentation, and also in, what we're doing in the project, is wondering why they would want control. Not necessarily that control is a good thing to have, although, in relation to wanting to control your experience of racism or control your experience of transphobia, I understand, we're sympathetic to the desire for control. What we're interested in interrogating is the material conditions in which that desire becomes more intense, I suppose. So I don't know that we're not in the non-sovereign camp. It's just we're trying to work at what we're noticing is that there was a very strong kind of presence within that they were saying that they wanted control, and wondering why that would be, as opposed to necessarily affirming it all the way through. So that, I think, partially speaks to what you were saying. I think I need some time to think about the other stuff. I'm going to let the other people speak, and then Shaka, I'm going to come back to you because it's going to take me a while to process some things. But yeah, if we can go to Monty, and we can go to, hopefully that answered a little bit of what you were getting at.
Sure, and we're going to come back to general Q&A at the end of this in any case, aren't we? So you've got some time to cook, Jamie. I'm now going to ask Monty to... Oh, sorry, no, I'm not. I'm going to ask Adam to introduce himself and speak, and Monty is last but not least. So, Adam, over to you, please.
Thanks. Sorry, thanks so much, John. It's a real pleasure to be joining you all this morning, my time, joining you from soon-to-be sunny Melbourne, Australia. I am Associate Professor of Public Health, and I work at the Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society at the Trobe University in Melbourne, which is, for all intents and purposes, an LGBTIQ health and wellbeing research group on our side of the world, obviously hailing from Wales in the UK originally. And I just want to say how excited I am to be here for this event. I know that sounds a bit cheesy, but I was reflecting back on conversations Jamie and I were having about this very project probably 5 or 6 years ago now, and the many times we sat in the library at the British Library together, kind of chewing over and what this project could look like. And it's just so fantastic to see it all come to a conclusion and to see what an amazing job that Jamie, Ingrid, James and Lauren have done with the project. So I just kind of wanted to say that right off the bat. I had, I guess, 3 key points I think I wanted to say in reflection to what I thought was a really, really excellent set of presentations from the team. Firstly, I loved it because it inverts what is a very pathological discourse about the lives of gay men, one that has always sought to construct smartphones and the apps that they host as sites of risk. And I think in a very similar manner to what happened in the emergence of web-based platforms in the early 2000s, things like Gaydar or gay.com, many were really quick to associate apps with HIV risk-related behavior. And I don't know how many dozens of papers have been written over the years about the association between the use of hookup apps and HIV and STI transmission risks, and any number of epidemiological studies in that context. And I think this is just so fabulous in disrupting that whole narrative and acknowledging that these apps can also be used as sites where we can reach gay men for a range of different kinds of discussions, which may be relevant for health promotion activities. And in ways that we never really thought possible in the kind of 80s and 90s, but also the ways in which gay men are using these apps as sites of intimacy, of sites of personal connection, or for building broader community connection. The building of the alternative communities, I think, was the phrase that James utilized, which I just thought was so appropriate. My second point, and I think working in a public health realm, I think public health researchers can be accused of being overly simplistic at times, so give me some license here. But I often feel personally that one of the key ambitions, and indeed one of the key strengths of qualitative research, is making the implicit explicit. It's the everyday aspects of our lives that we can struggle to articulate how and why they occur or they come about in the way that we do. And I think this is a really, really excellent example of how that's coming to life, how that implicit is being made explicit. So many of the findings, I think, about vulnerability in particular that Jamie was talking to feel so intuitive. Meeting and negotiating sex in physical spaces can be intensely anxiety provoking for any number of reasons. And it makes total sense, actually, that many gay men see mobile phones as a site of control that help them to negotiate their access to the intimacy that they may desire. Jamie also said that the stereotype is that out of control queer men use hookup apps to ferociously accumulate as many meaningless sex encounters rather, as possible. And so how can vulnerability possibly be a part of that kind of environment? And I think the answer is found in so many of the quotes that Ingrid and James and Jamie presented. It's found in the aspects of ourselves we hold close, or that we can at times be anxious to share, aspects about our lives, our abilities, our disabilities, how we think about or want to express our gender identity, our preferences, and our bodies. And I think the Digital Intimacies Project has done a really good job of recognizing and articulating the tightrope that many men walk in their attempts to both define both sex and intimacy, and how the digital can mediate this. And my third reflection was already articulated far more articulately by Marc, but speaks to a similar point, which is really about how I think access to intimacy is so intrinsically linked to positions of privilege and to enduring forms of racism and discrimination. The findings shine such a valuable light on how the experience of those from diverse cultural backgrounds face racism and hostility in a myriad of ways, both visible and less visible, as Ingrid talked to. And the motivations for using apps, the value they derive from doing so, can look and feel very different for white guys, and so too for trans and non-binary participants. But again, I think the findings are great in that they don't reflect just the challenges that trans people, for example, are experiencing, but also the ways in which they can make effective use of digital technologies to control information about them, about their bodies, and about how some use the technologies to try at least to facilitate a sense of safety. And finally, I just want to say to Lauren, that is so exciting, that work that you've done. And I've just been emailing this out to the entire center. I think that, sorry, I can't remember the word you used for it now, the cartoon strip, and you had a better term for it.
Yeah.
Sorry, thank you. I mean, good God, that's just amazing. Like, I think it's a lesson and an inspiration to all of us who have tended to do non-academic lay summaries of project findings in a, write it up in Word, and it's a one-page summary using some horrible Word template, and we send that into the world thinking that that's sufficient. And I think you've just raised the bar for all of us. So congratulations on that.
Thank you, Adam. So, there are a couple of interesting things there. I agree with Adam that the zine is fantastic, and I'm furiously jealous that I didn't cook this idea up. I've got a meeting next week where we've got to work out a way to communicate project findings to a diverse audience, and it's too late now for me to get my felt tips out and start writing a cartoon. Never mind. I think Adam's broad comment about the fact that this research has kind of disrupted an orthodox frame for thinking about app use, online, gay or men seeking men activity. Is there something that any of you, I don't think it's just Jamie or Ingrid, I think James might have something to say here. Is there something to add to that conversation, thinking about the way in which this research is actually breaking new ground and is disrupting the dominant ways of thinking about risk and the way in which sex and risk are kind of tethered together?
Yeah, I mean, I can say a few words. I mean, firstly, Adam, just thank you for those comments. I think you really summed up some of what we wanted to convey from the findings that are coming out of the project, which is really about how complex these issues are and how that kind of certain kind of sexual health research that you've alluded to does not do justice to the complexity of the ways that different groups of men are using these apps differently with lots of different motivations. And the thing that's really come out of, I think, from all of our presentations and the project overall is the kind of amount of thought and agency that the men that we've worked with express in using these technologies in this range of ways to negotiate all sorts of different kinds of intimacy, and to gain a sense, like I said, of control, but also to make themselves vulnerable in certain ways. So to work that negotiation between being vulnerable and having some degrees of control. So yeah, I think if what can come out of the project is a greater clarity and acknowledgement of that complexity of the ways that gay and bi men are using these technologies, I think that's brilliant. Thank you.
Should we move on to Monty then? Monty, over to you. If you can introduce yourself, please, and flabbergast us with your comments and feedback.
I can introduce myself. I'm not sure if I'm up to the second part of that challenge. Hi, I'm Monty Moncrieff. I'm the chief executive of an organisation called London Friends, and we've supported this project. We are an LGBT health and wellbeing charity based, unsurprisingly, in London, and a large piece of our work is on chemsex. We have a drug and alcohol service called Antidote, and through that we work with a lot of men, particularly men who have experienced problems associated with chemsex, and there's a very connected part of that to do with how they've engaged with other men on smartphone apps, and how they've used them to meet, and how sometimes it's been their initiation into drug use. I think I just want to say, like Marc, I'm really impressed by the inclusion of Black and Asian and other ethnic minority men in this, and also the trans and non-binary inclusion. It isn't always easy to do that, and I think the way that you've managed to do that is really admirable. I, like Adam, like things that sort of shattered the stereotype a little bit, particularly around the use of dating apps. So I think this kind of evidence is really useful for us when we're challenging people's perspectives, particularly when they may be finding it difficult to look beyond their immediate experience. I'm minded of a couple of other pieces of research that we use in similar ways, and I just thought it might be useful to reflect on that. So the chemsex study in 2014 that Adam was also involved in had some qualitative findings in there where people were talking about, well, it's really difficult to avoid chems because every time I go on the apps, I'm offered them, and 90% of other men are doing them. Well, the data that we have on prevalence of drug use, whether that's recent drug use or lifetime drug use, is nowhere near that level. So having some data around the prevalence allows us to challenge the perception that the majority of gay men are engaging in this behaviour. Similarly, I think it was also Sigma involved in some research a few years ago, which had the headline, "What Gay Men Really Want." And I think the tendency there, again, the stereotype was they're going to want sex as the primary thing. But actually where sex featured, it was in combination with a great emotional intimacy. And it was in combination with partner and a relationship stability, and in a sense of belonging and connection. So again, that's useful when we're challenging people who say, well, all everybody's looking for in London, where we're based, is casual sex, and nobody's actually looking for love like I am. Well, we've got 400 gay men telling us the same thing each year. So it's useful to have that as a perspective. And so I see this research really in a similar vein, allowing us to challenge some of the popular stereotypes that are there. And it's useful for us when we're working directly with men who have experienced difficulties connected with their sexual behaviour when it's related to apps and technology. I also welcome the positive aspects of app engagement as well, what apps can offer us, as opposed to just the negative impacts. And I reflect on my own experience there as a big, hairy gay man who would identify and be identified as a bear. Once I realised there were apps out there that catered for bears and bear admirers, it was like all my Christmases had come at once. It was a really positive experience in terms of how I engaged with partners and potential partners. And I think that's something which is lost from a bit of the narrative when we think about it. I think particularly, I know there's some international people on the call, but in the UK, we had a pretty awful case a few years ago, the gay man called Stephen Port, who murdered and sexually assaulted a number of other gay men who he'd met through Grindr, and he administered GHB, GBL to incapacitate his victims and to sexually assault and in 4 cases murder them. And apps were really demonized after that as if they were the driving force. So actually we know we've unfortunately had gay serial killers for years who haven't needed apps to commit those offences. So whilst it may have played a facilitative role in bringing the people together, I think it's important not to dwell on just that negative aspect. I thought it was really interesting how strongly vulnerability came out connected with intimacy, because I think obviously there is a connection between intimacy and vulnerability, but you don't need to be vulnerable to be intimate. So for it to come through so strongly was really interesting. And I think, I don't know where my thoughts are going with it, but it's making me reflect on, is there something about being a queer man that requires us to be more vulnerable inherently when we are trying to be intimate with other people? Is there something less avoidable about that, or is there something more innate in it? And I don't know that. It's just I'm kind of putting it out there also in my own head to reflect on that. What I did like is the sense of how people were talking about using the apps for greater control. And I think this is really interesting for us because we hear so many stories of people, feeling that their use of platforms like Grindr is out of control, or it's dominating their lives. So it feels like for us, there's quite a lot that we can learn about that in the way that we use content. And I think something like the zine is a really fun way of having a focus for the kind of workshops that Lauren was talking about, that we as third sector organisations doing that kind of psychoeducational workshops with people. We can use it as a basis for those conversations, and also use it to challenge people's perspectives that, they can't be in control of their app. We want people to be in control. We want them to have more control over the sex they're having. We're talking about sober sex, renegotiating relationships. These are really important parts of how we interact as queer men today. So I think having that as a basis, allowing us to challenge some of that, is a really positive thing. I wanted to just reflect as well briefly. It's made me think about if we can get to a point where people are engaging more positively on the apps, what are the implications for what we need to do as a society in order to get more people to that positive place in the first place, rather than it being for us to address in a situation where things have become a little bit more negative, or there have been negative impacts of that. And I'm not sure of the answer to that yet, but I think it's something for us to think about when we think about taking the research forward. And also, I just wanted to contrast. It's really interesting to think about the what seems to be a greater transmasculine inclusion in gay, ostensibly gay apps, with the pushback that we're currently getting from some cisgendered lesbians around the inclusion of trans women in some of those spaces there. It feels like it feels very, very different, and the narratives that are happening there, and it feels much more inclusive in these, I'm going to call them gay men spaces. So thank you so much for this research, and for the the fun and the usable outputs that we've got from that. They really will make a difference. They really will contrast with the work that we're doing very directly with people on the ground. And so thank you for the opportunity to respond to it too.
Thanks, Monty, for a lovely endorsement of the project. Now, I'm really conscious that we've got just over 10 minutes left. We will need to finish on time. The Great British Bake Off final is on, so I'm sure everyone will want to run away and watch that in any case. So it's over to the audience, please. Questions, comments. I can see comments coming in. Right, while we're waiting,
Comment from Misha, yeah.
Yeah, very early on, Misha had a question for Jamie. Misha, do you want to address your question directly to Jamie? I'm going to unmute you.
Now I'm unmuted. Yeah, thank you so much. This has been absolutely fascinating. And Jamie, I thought you gave it a great framing and a really great start. I'm really interested. And I was thinking, actually, particularly as sort of we started going through the your introductory presentations, I started thinking a bit more about sort of, you know, what Shaka mentioned about platforms and apps and the technicality of this, and you didn't really talk about whether there was something about sort of these digital technologies themselves, these intimate technologies, and these kind of matching or hookup apps themselves that might feed into certain kinds of vulnerability that weren't really there before, which would then, you know, which would then cause the use of devices and smartphones and everything to try to gain control, and whether there was any thinking about how those two aspects might work together.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Misha, for that. I'm going to answer that question. I think it kind of broadens out a little bit in some of the other comments that Shaka was making. So the kind of straightforward answer is yes. There were elements of kind of the particular technologies which arguably have brought around new types of vulnerabilities. And I think the quickest way to say that is the anonymity that these platforms provide mean that people are much less scared of trolling other people or attacking other people or asking the sorts of questions, for instance, to the trans masculine participants about their junk and about their transition, which the trans masculine participants would say that I wouldn't get asked that question in a sauna. Interestingly, talking about gay spaces, I was surprised to find out that the trans men we spoke to felt that saunas were inclusive places. I wouldn't have imagined that. So there is something specific about the digital there in that respect of bringing around new kind of vulnerabilities. But there is a reason, I think, why, just to maybe kind of claim my position a little more as to why I personally didn't concentrate so much on the platforms and the technologies, and perhaps why that was missing from the talk, or it wasn't as emphasized as much in the talk. First of all, because there's a lot of people that do brilliant kind of work on that. But second of all, it's partially from the kind of tradition of cultural studies where I kind of see myself and I position myself in my own work in the, it's what Lawrence Grossberg calls radically contextualist, right? So it's very much about the context. And so it's very much opposed to any sort of technologically deterministic explanation as to why these particularly mediated cultures might be about. It's because of the, so this also speaks a little to Shaka's question about the affordances of the platform. In some ways, it's a thought experiment because, I mean, I'm not aware, I mean, when we write the book, we will be talking about the affordances of the platform. But in some ways, it's a thought experiment. What happens when you kind of decenter the kind of affordances or the technologies from these questions? What do you end up seeing? And I think for me, you end up seeing so much more than just concentrating on. So the debates about the ethnicity filter came around because of the Black Lives Matter movement. And it raised lots of interesting questions for us, but it was just so important for us to center and to foreground that issue. And it goes a little, so I know we're kind of short of time, but it goes a little to Shaka's question, I suppose, in the, yeah, I am interested. I mean, we're interested in what ordinary people do in their everyday lives and how the concepts and affects and kind of infrastructures that they're able to mobilize to make their everyday lives more kind of livable. And the technologies are part of that, but it's also, you know, the question was phrased, how do they use it to negotiate their cultures of intimacy? We're interested in mapping the cultures of intimacy and the degrees to which their phones can help them do that. In a context where phones have transformed what cultures mean, of course, but it's a broader question that we're interested in asking, which I think also, anyway, yeah, I think that probably answers it, but thank you, Misha.
That was really great. Thank you so much.
So we've got a question from Schwab. He's got his little paw up.
Sorry, I'm in my long johns and not interested for this, but oh my God, thank you so much. Why am I clapping? Well, I'm trying to get my hand down. This was really, really rich in material. And again, like others have done, this notion of vulnerability and control that came up just got me all really kind of fueled. So, and obviously, as you may imagine, Jamie, this hint at trying to demystify that, or debunk the myth that, you know, gay men are not just using this for out of control sex, or that they're not just using the apps for out of control sex, but actually they're looking for other things other than sex, like connection and etc. And so obviously you can see how that's to me that separation between sex and connection or connection or may come across, may have kind of sent some red flags, but I mean, I have so much to tell you, or to ask you to talk to you about this, but I think my main concern, given shortness of time, is, do you find some tension in these coexistence of vulnerability and control? And do you, and how, and can vulnerability and control still be something that can be mapped into the out of control gay man looking, you know, like collect loads over a weekend, as they say? Because as you were talking, I was thinking about, you know, play, as on Susanna's book. I was thinking also about, you know, just being on the apps as being really gamification and playing and just spending time, like I spent talking to bots. But this idea of like setting up a space or having control over a space where you can actually lose the control, right? So this, to try to find a way to negotiate these, what came across to me at least as a move to say, look, it's not just about sex, it's about these other things that you people who don't do this also value, like finding community, finding connection, etc. So how do you see that maybe also mapping into, you know, the sex maniac weekend long cum collecting sex marathon?
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple of things. One is that we're slightly limited by our data set. We're limited by our methods. We spoke to people who perhaps don't identify as sex radicals and who are going to only admit certain things to us in their interviews. So we're not reflecting on the nature of sex and intimacy. We're reflecting on what they told us about their sex and intimate lives. But there was, I've tried to add an inflection in the presentation where I talked about people feeling vulnerable, even in anonymous sex, right? And people did articulate that. So no one, James and Ingrid did the interviews. I don't recall that anyone specifically talked about these kind of, weekend long kind of, losing yourself. I don't think we found people that spoke about that. We did speak to a couple who were much more kind of in line with Monty's the type of person that perhaps you're used to speaking to. So the narrative was completely different. We absolutely don't believe that there's two. So we're not trying to make a normative, we're not trying to present homonormative findings around this. Actually, what one of the pages that Lauren did was really expand the notion of sex and intimacy. And so one of them was, about threading eyebrows as a radical space against non-normal. And I understand, the lack of that figure that you're talking about, Joao, isn't because we don't believe that's possible. It's just because who we ended up speaking to. I mean, one of the pages talks about how, I would say, one of the pages that we in the fanzine was about. It was funny to me because Lauren was like, one of the ways that people maintain kind of harm reduction was reducing their sexual partners. Well, this guy was one of those people, although he spoke about it in very controlled terms. I mean, it was quite an erotic experience reading his interview because he was someone who enjoyed BDSM and went out on the scene and did all this stuff, but it was in hyper control. In an erotic way, and he reduced his number of partners to 6 people. That was his reduction of. So we did get aspects of that. That's true. Actually, now I think about it, that's a good example of what you're talking about. The control that was a very specific kind of manifestation of a particular investment in BDSM and establishing the terms. I mean, it seemed like the establishing the terms was the erotic thing. Actually, I mean, you can read. You'll be able to read the interviews. We're going to upload them onto a public, and it's a sexy experience, but it's control so that you can have a lack of control. So in that respect, you're right. There was one interviewee that did do that for sure.
Can I come in on this just briefly? Is that what we didn't talk about today, but which permeated the data, is we were doing interviews as lockdown was beginning to lift, right? So we were doing this in the context of everyone being told to stop hooking up with people who weren't in your, so we've written a paper on this that you've probably seen, but I think it's also kind of, it was a very particular time that we were doing interviews, so people were reflecting on what intimacy meant for them. So then maybe the interviews weren't about all of the sex that people were having, but there was quite a lot in there about the sex that people wanted, the intimacy that people wanted, and how our participants were navigating care for themselves and others, and navigating this public health crisis in the context of queer communities who were excluded from all of the policy and all of the harm reduction strategies, right? It was an entirely heteronormative policy response, and our participants were navigating that and trying to work that out. So I think we also need to kind of keep that in context. And people did talk about kind of what are they going to, what did they do before? What were their practices before? And how are they thinking about those maybe differently in the context of COVID and where they anticipated going? So I think just to flag that up, that we're thinking about conjunctural analysis. The pandemic really played an important role in, and continues to play an important role in I think the possibilities of what intimacy has been and could be in these contexts. So just to kind of flag that up.
Colleagues, we're out of time. We could go on and on and on, I think. Thanks so much to everybody for their contributions. Thanks to the project team for really thought-provoking presentations and fantastic research that's going to be so useful to so many people. Mika, if you want to email Jamie or Ingrid with your question, I'm sure they'd be happy to answer your question. There's still a final question, but we're going to leave everybody to go now.
Just quickly, I think people are leaving anyway, but we've got a survey that I've just put, I'll type it in again. It'd be great, it'd be very useful for us if you could fill out that survey. It would take a couple of minutes. It's just about what you thought of this and how it's changed or not changed or how you might use it. I'll send it out tomorrow over email, but it's there. If you could do it, it would be massively helpful to us.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.